Moan, brethren, moan, for lo, the rebel spheres spin round, the stars their ancient courses keep. Clouds still with shadowy moisture haunt the earth, still stuck their fill of light from sun and moon. Still buds the tree, and still the seashores murmur, there is no death in all the universe. Hey, it's me, High Grade Ha, and I love cosmic and existential horror. I love all horror, really, from the fairy tale oddness of Pan's Labyrinth to the pulpy undead action of Resident Evil to the gothic ornate psychodrama of Hannibal. But there's something about existential horror and cosmic horror which I consider an offshoot that just speaks to my weird, squishy brain cage. Traditional horror, despite it often introducing uncanny or unexplainable forces into the normal world, also has a tendency to reinforce the same status quo it disrupts by having the protagonist strive to return to some semblance of normality, whether that be defeating the ancient threat or freeing the spirit from their earthly shackles to end a haunting. But existential horror is genuinely subversive and disturbing. It disturbs our sense of ourselves and our place in the universe. All our bearings, all our assumptions, our entire maps of reality are vaporized and replaced with the horrifying clarity of hitherto unseen dimensions writhing out towards infinity. Existential horror is like a parasite. It nestles into your neurons and burrows inside your chest. It lives in you. Part 1. Cosmic horror. We can't talk about cosmic horror without first talking about everyone's favourite daft racist uncle, H.P. Lovecraft. Were he alive today, he'd be ruining everyone's Christmas dinner by banging on about refugees. Just pass the fucking sprouts, Howard. Luckily for us, for every xenophobic screed he left behind, he also left some damn fine stories. You could even argue that Lovecraft's prejudices are responsible for the underlying sense of paranoia that permeates his work and gives it such a unique tone. The upshot of this is it means that people who aren't Lovecraft have been able to do some very interesting, not racist work, building on the legacy he left behind, which is neat. Lovecraft called the philosophy behind his fiction cosmicism, which Trung Nguyen outlines as the belief that there is no recognizable divine presence, such as a god, in the universe, and that humans are particularly insignificant in the larger scheme of intergalactic existence. You've read the title already, so you know what game the video is about. But there's still a big what if we need to address before we dig into Returnal. Is Atropos, the planet on which Returnal takes place, real? More specifically, does the planet of Atropos exist in any physical form at all? Or is the entire journey just Celine's imagination? Later plot revelations in the game point strongly to the latter. We must at least admit that whatever Atropos is, it knows Celine better than she knows herself. We need to answer this because our answer forms the basis of how we see Returnal in relation to Lovecraft's cosmicism, and more broadly, the entire genre of cosmic horror. My initial take was that Returnal's fiction contains some sort of event horizon type dealio, a sort of eldritch phenomenon, whether that be a planet or a wormhole or some sort of electrical storm or psychic disturbance. And this phenomenon was a sort of parasitical entity that feeds off Celine's subconscious and projects Atropos as she sees it. This would be a clever way to centre a deeply human, deeply personal story within a mode of fiction that typically reduces the human experience to insignificant. But I also recognise in myself a deep longing to want Atropos to be real somehow because of the layer of mystery and scope it adds to the overall story. I wonder what this says about me, about the sort of stories I like. Like Celine, I find myself longing for something concrete to hold on to, even as all evidence points to something far more intangible and far more sad. Of the many Lovecraftian tropes that have become synonymous with his style of fiction, perhaps the most enduring has been the representation of what the writer frequently refers to as non-Euclidean geometry, or, in other words, shapes that don't make no sense, especially to a mind raised in the stifling prison of squares and right angles and such. The Lovecraftian protagonist watches in horror as these notable geometric signifiers of reality as it should be are stripped away. From here, a pernicious type of insanity starts to set in. one that comes not from degradation but being forced to reconcile the impossible with their previously held maps of reality itself. But here's where Returnal differs. So much of the horror Selene experiences on Atropos is almost the polar opposite of this trope. Sure, there's chthonic structures and vast temple-like complexes, but the environments of Atropos are not terrifying because they're unfamiliar. In fact, the moments of discovery and mapping the planet early on are the most hopeful things get. Instead, Atropos' horrors are hyper-familiar. Atropos is, for Selene, the internal made vast, the silent made deafening, and the latent made hostile. Is Atropos real? You might as well ask someone if they can point at their depression, if they can describe the shape of their regret. Although the shape of Selene's regret seems very convincing indeed. Part 2. Tentacles. If we look at the way the image of Lovecraft's Cthulhu has endured, I think there's something there beyond just the effect that cosmic horror has left on pop culture. There's just something so genuinely powerful about the image of a gigantic alien psychic squid dwelling in an ancient underwater city. It almost feels primal, like it's resonating with something deep in our subconscious, like a spider or sharp teeth or fast-moving shadows. I'm not saying there was a point in humanity's history where we had to learn to be deeply afraid of squids. A period so traumatic has been imprinted on our genetic memory. But if you're anything like me, Cthulhu and Cthulhu-esque imagery just hits differently than other things that you find scary. It's both epochal and impossibly ancient. There is at least some scientific basis to think like this. Studies have shown that giving crotcheted octopus toys to premature babies can actually help calm the child and keep them healthy. Studies show that squeezing their tentacles led to better breathing, more regular heartbeats, and higher levels of oxygen in their blood. This is, according to research, because the tentacles remind the newborn of their umbilical cords. So turn the image around. Remove the comforting and cute crotcheted calamari and turn it into something horrific. And there's a very real possibility that Cthulhu has endured so powerfully because the image resonates with a precognitive memory buried deep within our collective psyches. There's a suggestion in Returnal that many of the visual motifs and capabilities of Atropos flora and fauna are extrapolated through Selene's trauma from Helios' toy Octo. The luminescent appendages, the wriggling tentacles. Octopi are the closest thing we have to aliens here on Earth. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine them morphing into bizarre eldritch monstrosities. But it's possible these images also point to something stranger and more abstract, a lingering natal trauma that surrounds Selene's relationship to her family. Invisible umbilical cords stretching through time and space, severed and unsevered, discarded and inescapable. What's particularly chilling about the truth behind Selene's trauma is that it's hiding in plain sight as soon as we start the game. Not just in the message that reads, Helios abandoned every run, a reference we later learn to her child, but in the first enemy we meet. If we read the lore entry for the Kerberon or tentacle dogs after fighting enough of them, we'll learn that these creatures occasionally eat their young from self-preservation or, quote, a failure to bond. Once you know the full story of Returnal, this is a deeply disturbing detail to think about. The very first hostile creature Selene meets on Atropos embodies her most hidden shames. Altogether, I feel these types of details are a far more resonant use of cosmic horror tropes than having Selene, say, battle the giant alien squid she meets near the end. In fact, I'd say Returnal's take on existential horror lines up with another, more recent horror writer much more than Lovecraft himself.
Part 3. Puppets. The first time I read a Thomas Ligotti short story, it terrified me so much that I had to put the book down, then cover the book with another book, because just looking at the front cover brought me back to the same feeling of sheer terror I had while reading that awful, brilliant story.
As are tentacles to Lovecraft, puppets are to Ligotti, a familiar motive within his tales, although employed in a far more nuanced and thoughtful way than, say, a freaky Chucky doll. Here's Ligotti on puppets.
They have nothing in their heads. They are unreal. When they are in motion, we know they are moved by an outside force. When they speak, their voices come from elsewhere. Their orders come from somewhere behind and beyond them. And were they ever to become aware of that fact, they would collapse at the horror of it all, as would we.
To Ligotti, human consciousness is, quote, the parent of all horrors. The puppet unnerves us because, in part, it is us, an unthinking marionette driven not by free will, but by a will to live enforced by our own consciousness. There is a puppet in Returnal, a disembodied representation of Celine's humanity that unveils her almost mechanical lack of free will as she relives the cycle of mistakes. And this puppet wears an astronaut suit. The astronaut feels predestined to haunt Celine's every step as much as she feels destined to run from it. When the final revelations of the story come to bear, we realize Celine's cycle is far more wide-reaching and far more fatalistically tragic than we ever could have foreseen. Another of Ligotti's preoccupations is that of mad gods, of all life existing in the mind of a creator itself driven insane by the curse of consciousness, a self-cannibalizing deity tearing itself apart, and humanity as a tiny microcosm of the greater being's anguish. A creator and a destroyer. Part 4. Hope? Question mark? If you read the logs in Returnal's menu, you'll get snippets of lore which grow based on how many times you've defeated an enemy or collected an item. But even fully complete, they'll still contain redacted text with words like error or data corrupted. This is Returnal's approach to horror storytelling in miniature. It's the same technique Lovecraft and his contemporaries used to impart images of the impossible upon the reader. The words that are there set the mood, but the words that aren't there spark imagination. They spark wonder, fear, and possibility. That feeling you get when you've read those missing words and try to fill in the blanks for yourself, that's cosmic horror in a particularly unnerving nutshell. The most fascinating unanswered mystery in Returnal is the recurring motif of the creator-destroyer. It immediately evokes an image of the sort of mad Ligottian god I mentioned before, but it's also applicable to Celine herself, who at once dreamed up Atropos and scourges it of alien life each run. But it could also refer to Celine's relationship with Helios, the way she brought him into the world, and the way she also blames herself for his death. But there's another reading too. What if it refers to both Celine and her mother, Thea? Both are creators, Thea with Celine, Celine with Helios, and both, in Celine's mind, are also destroyers. She destroyed Helios, her mother destroyed, for Celine, any chance of the life she wanted. And then again, maybe it's all of these. What if, as Celine's guilt became what the game calls the cosmic afterbirth, she literally birthed an entire dream world, an unknown Kadath as real as unreal, as the creatures inside her universe suffer and war and tear themselves apart. Celine realizes she has passed her own sins onto her creation. After all, what's more tragic than a mad god, except a mad god that realizes and cares how that madness is affecting her children, her progeny, severed from the hive mind. This is all speculation. I'm not sure the specifics matter as much as the takeaway that this idea of a creator-destroyer is a pretty significant archetype within Celine's subconscious. And the further I dig into Returnal's subconscious, the more I find myself compelled to admit that Celine probably never really leaves Earth in the traditional sense during Returnal. But all truly great cosmic horror uses space as a projection of the interior self anyway. What's clear is that wherever Celine goes, whether that's to the far reaches of space or just downstairs to the basement, she'll never escape herself. Hang on, didn't I call this section Hope? Okay, let's try and end on a hopeful note. The real reason, I think, that I love cosmic and existential horror is that, strangely, I find it the most heroic mode of all fiction, even when it ends badly. After all, what's more heroic than knowing, not just suspecting, but really knowing, the ultimate futility and horror and blackly comic malignancy of the entire universe and still choosing to go on regardless? If the journey is more important than the destination, then it follows that minor moments of triumph, even when they lead to inevitable failure, are worth pursuing for their own sake. We don't just lie down and die on first becoming aware of our own mortality after all. And Celine, despite her guilt and her trauma and her sadness and her self-hatred, does not go gentle into that good loop. And neither should we. Horrors portioned to a giant nerve make great Hyperion ache, his palace bright, bastioned with pyramids of glowing gold and touched with shades of bronzed obelisks, glares a blood red through all the 1,000 courts, arches and domes and fiery galleries, rest divine upon exalted couch, and slumber in the arms of melody. Thanks for watching. Fucking sprout.